So many of these Monti di Pietà, they are established, but they get into financial trouble because they were asking for a reduced interest rate. So it was not viable at the end, also with all these problems. And some of them go bankrupt, but many of them, they start getting into debt to continue their activity. So they need to lend money to continue their activity. And who is lending them money? The Jews. So you have a situation in which the Monte di Pietà was established in order to avoid the Jews would lend money at interest to Christians, and the situation is that the Monti di Pietà themselves are borrowing against from the Jews, which is an ironic twist of history if you think about it. As also, of course, the agitation of the church and the monastic order continues, and as a result of the restrictive measure promulgated by the church, some Jews prefer now to go to territories which were under control of some local rulers, which were well disposed towards them, and that's how we see the development of important Jewish community in Mantua, where there was the Gonzaga dynasty who was very friendly to them, in Ferrara with the Este dynasty, and later on in Livorno, because of the Grand Duke Ferdinand and Livornina. We'll talk about it. So up to, let's say, 1492, we can see that the situation in Italy is better than in other European countries. They were living throughout the entire Italian territory up to 1492, and had not encountered widespread massacres and expulsion like France, Germany, England, Spain, and so on. But these good periods, well, if we can call it like this, comes to an end from the end of the 15th century onwards. What happens? The main problem was, at the beginning, the policy of the Spanish kings towards the Jews, because this extended also to Spanish possessions in Italy. And another problem was the birth of Protestantism, so the Counter-Reformation, and the attitude of the Catholic Church in the middle of its struggle against Protestantism. So when the expulsion of the Jews, everyone knows the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492. But few people know that this expulsion also hit the Jews of Sicily and Sardinia, which were under direct Aragonese rule in 1493. So they were expelled with 6 months delay compared to the expulsion in Spain. And it was even worse than the Spanish expulsion, because in fact their property was confiscated, which didn't happen in Spain. So it is estimated that, and most of the Jewish population in fact was concentrated in Sicily at the time in Italy. So tens of thousands of Jews left Sicily. In Sardinia there were much less. Where do they go? They go to continental Italy, while a sizable number of them choose other lands such as North Africa, Greece, Turkey, and the East in general. Another reason why I say that it was worse is because shortly afterwards, the whole of south of Italy comes under Aragonese rule, and they are also expelled from there. It became part of Spain, the rest of South Italy, in 1503. So in 1510, it was ordered the expulsion of all the Jews from South Italy. Only 200 wealthy families were allowed to remain. They were given the same choice: either you convert or you leave. But it was much worse than in Spain, because 5 years later, the church realizes that it's impossible to see if the new Christians were really Christians, let's say, sincerely Christians, or if they continue to profess the Jewish faith in secrecy. So you know what? They expel also all the new Christians. So in Spain, at least, the people converted to Christianity could remain. Of course, they were subject to unfortunately, to the Inquisition, and they had to be careful and so on. But from South Italy, even all the new Christians were expelled. No one remained, neither Jew or no new Christian. And the south of Italy remained totally empty there was not a single Jew remaining in South Italy until very, very late in 1861. So South Italy becomes a barren desert for Jews or converted Christians and so on. At the time, luckily, the popes in Rome were well disposed towards the Jews. This was the case also in 1492, in fact, because the Pope at the time was Spanish, Alexander I, and he welcomed the Sephardic Jews. They were less welcomed by the local Italian Jews because they were afraid of competition, but many Jews, in fact, especially from 1492, ended up in Rome, and you have this Sephardic synagogue in Rome. You have the Catalan synagogue, the Castilian synagogue, and so on. That's the beginning of it. And even Venice starts to treat them a bit better than it used to be the case in the 60s. It used to be the case before, even though in 1516 Venice decides to limit Jewish residents to the ghetto and not to other parts of town. So we have the birth of the first ghetto in Europe, Venice, in 1516. The problem starts for Jews in Italy in 1553. There was a pope who hated, in fact, his hatred towards Jews were mostly motivated by the fact that he hated the Spaniards. He considered the Spaniards to be a big mixture of Jews, Muslim, and Christian, and so on. And he was calling them heretics, schismatics, cursed by God, offspring of Jews and Arabs, excrements of the world. That's how the Pope was speaking when he was referring to the Spanish. And for him, those Jews who were expelled from Italy and from Spain and had reached Italy, they were also part of his hatred and so on. So this Pope, Paul IV, publishes a bull, you say bulla, or bull, called Cum Nimis Absurdum, in which it obliges all the Jews of central Italy, which were living in many, many big, small towns everywhere, from the region of Lazio, Umbria, Toscana, Marche, and so on. Lazio, Umbria, Marche. They obliged them to concentrate only in Rome and Ancona, in 2 ghettos, where they should be locked at night. They were prohibited to engage in any commercial activities, those of Rome, not Ancona, except the sale of rags. They were obliged to sell their houses and submitted them to the most harassing restriction ever enacted during the previous centuries. At the same time, disaster strikes in Ancona. The Pope decides to burn at stake 25 Portuguese marranos, which had reached Ancona because the previous Pope had welcomed, in fact, Jews and marranos to come to Ancona. So 25 of them are burned at stake because they were found guilty to having returned to Judaism. And finally, in 1569, all Jews are expelled from all the states of the church. Then there was a shorter spike period, but the expulsion becomes definitive in 1593. So you have all regions like Latium, Umbria, Marche, Romagna, with the exception of Rome, Ancona, and Avignon, which was also, it was in France, but it was part of the state of the church. You find that's the only 3 places where you find Jews in central Italy. There is an interesting story about the Jews of Ancona. In fact, Ancona was at the connected point of a sort of inverted T. Was the connecting point of 2 different great commercial roads, where the vertical part went upwards towards Ferrara, Milan, Basel, Antwerp, and up to London, and the horizontal part was going to Florence, Genova, Basel, Antwerp, and London. This is the reason why the Pope accepted some Jews could still stay in Ancona. He needed them for trade. And the port of Ancona was a harbor of a crossroad for goods coming from the east and directed west and directed north. So the burning of these Portuguese Jews jeopardized this trade. And for the first time in Jewish history, this is, I think, a story at least some of you are familiar with. For the first time in Jewish history, the Jews tried to act together as an organized economical and political force and tried to enforce a boycott of the port of Ancona, to be replaced with the one of Pesaro, 80 kilometers north, although the results were partial and were limited to a few years. How many of you know the story of Dona Gracia Nassi or Gracia Mendes? I'm sure, yes, you do know. So in fact, this was one of the wealthiest women in Renaissance Europe. She married a converso who had made a fortune with a black pepper trade in Portugal, from Portugal to the Indies. His husband died relatively early, so she inherited all his fortune. She was born in Lisbon in 1510 under the name of Beatrice de Luna, and after the death of her husband, she moves to Antwerp. But in 1536, the Inquisition is established also in Antwerp, so she escapes, and she goes where? To Italy. She goes to Italy, first to Venice, then to Ferrara, and later on to the Ottoman Empire, where she openly comes back and profess Judaism. This is what happens. She moves to Constantinople, and as I said, she tries to organize this boycott of the port of Ancona. Disaster then strikes again, this time in the north of Italy, because the region of Lombardy and Trentino, they become also part of the Spanish crown. So first thing they do, they expel all the Jews also from these two regions. So 1 century earlier,